The courtroom was silent. Every eye was on Judge Olivia Carter as she sat at the bench, her face calm but her presence commanding. Across from her, Officer Jake Simmons stood with his arms crossed, smirking like he owned the place. He had been called in for misconduct, accused of using excessive force during an arrest. But instead of taking the matter seriously, he had spent the last 10 minutes making snide comments, rolling his eyes, and, most shockingly, mocking the judge right to her face. "So what now, Your Honor?" he scoffed, exaggerating the title in a mocking tone. "Are you going to give me a little lecture on how to be a good boy? Maybe I should write 100 times, 'I promise to be a nice officer'?" He smirked, and a few gasps echoed in the courtroom. The gallery was packed, reporters scribbling furiously. Olivia's grip on her gavel tightened, but she remained composed. "Officer Simmons," she said, her voice cool, "I would advise you to watch your tone." "Oh, come on," Jake said with a smirk. "Let's be real. You don't know what it's like out there, sitting behind a desk, passing judgment, while people like me deal with the real criminals. This whole thing is a joke." Then, he did something no one expected. He laughed, loudly, and then, he clapped. Mocking applause filled the courtroom. The entire room froze. No one had ever seen anything like this. A police officer openly mocking a judge, especially in a courtroom, was unheard of. Some people gaped in disbelief. Others held their breath. But what happened next shocked everyone. Judge Olivia took a deep breath, pushed back her chair, and stood. Her presence was powerful, and when she finally spoke, her voice sent a chill through the entire courtroom. "You think this is a joke?" she asked, her voice steady. "You think your uniform makes you untouchable?" Jake smirked. "I don't think, I know." The judge's eyes narrowed. And then, without missing a beat, she said 5 words that changed everything. "Officer Simmons, you are under arrest." The courtroom exploded. People gasped. Reporters scrambled to capture the moment, and Jake's smug expression vanished. "What?" he said, his voice now shaky. You can't do that." But it was too late. The bailiff stepped forward, cuffs in hand. Jake started backing away. "This is crazy," he yelled. "You can't arrest a cop. This is a setup." Judge Olivia didn't flinch. "You have disrespected this court, obstructed justice, and now you will face the consequences." Jake looked around the room, expecting someone to defend him. But all he saw were cold, disappointed stares. No one was laughing anymore. The bailiff reached for his wrist. Then, Jake ran. The entire courtroom erupted into chaos as the arrogant officer bolted for the exit. What happened next no one could have predicted. A few days earlier, Olivia Carter had been a judge for 5 years. She had seen all kinds of people, liars, thieves, criminals who thought they were above the law. But nothing could have prepared her for Officer Jake Simmons. It started with a case. A young man named Eric Walker had been accused of resisting arrest. The arresting officer? Jake Simmons. Eric's mother, a woman named Diane Walker, had come to court in tears, begging Judge Olivia to hear her son's side of the story. "He didn't resist," she had said. "Officer Simmons, he just didn't like the way my boy talked back. So he beat him." The courtroom had gone silent. It was a serious accusation. Olivia looked at the evidence. The bruises, the medical reports, the shaky video footage from a bystander's phone. It was enough to make her stomach turn. And then, Jake Simmons had walked into her courtroom for the first time. He was tall, muscular, and walked with the confidence of someone who had never been told no. His uniform was pressed, his badge gleamed under the lights, and the smirk on his face told Olivia everything she needed to know. He didn't think this was serious. He thought he was untouchable. "Officer Simmons," Olivia had said that day, "you're here because of allegations of excessive force." Jake had shrugged. "Allegations made by a punk kid who doesn't respect the law." Olivia studied him. "Did you use force that night?" Jake leaned back in his chair, smirking. "I did my job. That was how it started." That was the first time Olivia had seen the arrogance in his eyes. But it wouldn't be the last. Over the next few days, Olivia had dug deeper. She looked into Jake's past. Complaint after complaint. Excessive force. Verbal abuse. Threats. Yet, somehow, he had never been punished. Why? Because people were afraid of him. Because he was a cop. And because no one had ever dared to stand up to him. Until now. The day of the trial, Olivia had already made up her mind. Jake Simmons needed to be held accountable. She just didn't expect him to mock her in front of everyone. She didn't expect him to clap, to smirk, to laugh in her face. And she definitely didn't expect him to run. But now, he was on the run. And Olivia knew. This was just the beginning. Chaos erupted in the courtroom. Gasps, shouts, and the scraping of chairs filled the air as Officer Jake Simmons bolted toward the double doors at the back of the room. His polished black boots thudded against the marble floor, echoing through the high ceilings. "Stop him," someone yelled. The bailiff lunged, but Jake was fast, too fast. He shoved past two reporters, knocking over one of their cameras. A woman screamed as he burst through the doors, disappearing into the courthouse hallway. Judge Olivia Carter stood frozen for a moment, gripping the edge of her bench. She had expected resistance, maybe even outrage. But this? A police officer running from the law in front of a packed courtroom? Unacceptable. "Seal the building," she ordered, her voice sharp. "Now." The bailiff sprang into action, rushing out the doors after him. The courtroom was still in an uproar, people whispering frantically, reporters scrambling to type their breaking news updates. Did that just happen? A cop ran from a judge? He's toast. This is going to be all over the news. Olivia barely heard them. She was already reaching for her phone, dialing the courthouse security team. "This is Judge Carter," she said firmly. "Officer Jake Simmons is fleeing the building. Lock down all exits. No one leaves until he is in custody." The weight of what had just happened pressed down on her. No officer in their right mind would try to escape inside a courthouse. It was the worst possible place to run. There were cameras everywhere, armed bailiffs, and only a handful of exits, all of which were now being secured. Jake had to know that. So why did he run? She didn't have time to answer that question because, just then, her phone buzzed again. It was one of the bailiffs, out of breath. He's gone," the man panted. Olivia's stomach dropped. "What do you mean, gone?" He must have had this planned. He knew the layout of the courthouse. Took the emergency stairwell, slipped through one of the back exits before we could lock it down. "He's not here, Your Honor." Judge Olivia's blood ran cold. Jake Simmons had escaped. 2 hours earlier, Jake Simmons sat in the courtroom hallway, leaning against the cool stone wall. His lawyer, a heavy-set man in his 50s named Richard Lawson, sat beside him, flipping through a stack of papers. "Look, Jake," Richard muttered, lowering his voice. "This Judge, Carter? She's not like the others." Jake snorted, rolling his eyes. "Please, they're all the same. A bunch of suits who don't have a clue how things work in the real world." Richard sighed, rubbing his forehead. "That arrogance of yours? It's exactly why we're here." Jake shot him a glare. "You're supposed to be on my side." "I am," Richard said sharply. "Which is why I'm telling you to stop acting like this is some kind of joke. This judge has a reputation for being tough. She won't back down." Jake smirked. "She's never met me." Richard groaned and shook his head. "You just don't get it, do you? You have more complaints against you than any officer I've ever defended. You've been lucky so far. But if Carter decides to make an example of you..." Jake waved a hand dismissively. "Relax. She's just another weak little judge who likes to act tough from behind a desk. Watch me walk out of here without a scratch." He was so sure of himself. But then, he had no idea what was coming. Present time. Jake's heart pounded as he ran down the dark alleyway behind the courthouse. He had barely made it out. The moment the judge had uttered those 5 words, "Officer Simmons, you are under arrest," something inside him snapped. He wasn't about to be arrested. He was a cop. Cops didn't get arrested. But the way the room had turned on him, the way the judge had looked at him, unshaken, unafraid, for the first time in his career, he had felt real fear. So he ran. And now, he had to figure out his next move. He couldn't go home. That would be the first place they'd look. He couldn't call any of his friends at the department. Not yet. If they were smart, they'd distance themselves from him. The entire city was about to turn on him. His mind raced. Then he remembered someone. He pulled out his phone, hands still shaking, and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. The call rang 3 times before a gruff voice answered. "Who is this?" "It's Jake," he said, glancing over his shoulder. "I need a place to hide." A long pause. Then, "Come to the old garage. Now." The line went dead. Jake slipped his phone back into his pocket and hurried toward his car. He had a plan. At least, he thought he did. Meanwhile, Judge Olivia Carter sat at her desk, staring at the security footage playing on her laptop. The escape had been fast, too fast. Jake had known exactly where to go, which doors to take, which cameras to avoid. That wasn't luck. That was planning, which meant he had no intention of going down without a fight. She sighed, rubbing her temples. This case had already turned into something bigger than she had expected. Her phone buzzed. It was her clerk, Daniel. "Judge, you need to see this." "What is it?" "It's all over the news. The headlines." Olivia turned on her television, and her stomach clenched. "Breaking news. Police officer flees courtroom after judge orders his arrest." The video played again. Jake's smug grin, his mocking applause, then the moment his face twisted into shock when she declared his arrest. The reporters had already turned this into a spectacle. The public was watching. And now, the whole country knew about Officer Jake Simmons. Olivia took a deep breath. One thing was certain. Jake Simmons wasn't just running from the law. He was running from justice. And she was going to make sure he didn't get away. Jake Simmons gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. His car sped down the dark streets of the city, weaving through traffic as he headed toward the only place he could think of, the old garage. His mind was racing. His career was over. He knew that much. There was no talking his way out of this one. The whole world had just watched him bolt like a common criminal. He had been untouchable once, feared, respected. Now, he was a fugitive. His hands trembled as he reached for the radio. He turned it on, needing to hear what they were saying about him. Officer Jake Simmons is now wanted for resisting arrest and obstruction of justice. He cursed under his breath. Judge Olivia Carter issued the arrest warrant after Simmons mocked her in open court. Jake clenched his jaw. The courthouse lockdown failed to capture him, and he remains at large. He turned the radio off. He didn't need to hear any more. They were making him sound like some kind of monster. He wasn't the bad guy here. He was a cop. Cops weren't supposed to be hunted down like this. His thoughts were interrupted as he pulled up to the garage. It was an old auto shop on the outskirts of town, shut down years ago. The windows were boarded up, the metal door rusted. Jake parked, killed the engine, and got out. A single light flickered above the door. He knocked twice. A moment later, the door creaked open. A man stood there, his face half hidden in the shadows. He was older, his hair graying at the edges, his expression hard. It had been years since Jake had seen him, but he still recognized that face. Frank Mitchell, a retired cop, and one of the dirtiest men Jake had ever known. Frank stepped aside, letting Jake in. The smell of oil and dust filled the air. "You look like hell," Frank muttered, shutting the door. Jake exhaled sharply. "I need a place to lay low." Frank studied him for a moment, then chuckled. "Didn't think I'd ever see the day when the great Jake Simmons came crawling to me." Jake glared at him. "Are you going to help me or not?" Frank walked over to an old workbench, picking up a cigarette. He lit it, took a slow drag, then exhaled. "Depends," Frank said. "What exactly are you running from?" Jake's jaw tightened. "A judge. A courtroom full of people. And half the damn city." Frank chuckled again. "Yeah, I saw the news." He flicked ashes onto the floor. "You really screwed up this time, kid." Jake ran a hand through his hair, pacing. "I didn't screw up. That judge, Carter, she's got it out for me. She thinks she can take me down just to prove a point." Frank raised an eyebrow. "And what point would that be?" Jake scowled. "That cops aren't above the law." Frank smirked. "Funny thing is, she's right." Jake's hands curled into fists. "Don't start with that." Frank leaned against the workbench. "Relax, kid. I'm not here to judge. I'm here to tell you the truth." He took another drag. "You ain't gonna win this one." Jake exhaled sharply. "So what? I should just turn myself in?" Frank snorted. "No. You should be smart." Jake narrowed his eyes. "What do you mean?" Frank tapped his cigarette. You got dirt on people, don't you? Jake hesitated. Maybe. Frank gave him a knowing look. Then use it. If you go down, take some people with you. Jake frowned, thinking. He did have dirt. A lot of it. But was he really that desperate? Before he could answer, a sound made both men freeze. The wail of sirens. Getting closer. Jake's stomach dropped. You sold me out? Frank held up his hands. Wasn't me, kid. I don't do that to my own. But Jake wasn't listening. His mind was already in survival mode. He ran to the back door, peeking through the gap. Police cars. 3 of them. They had found him. Frank sighed. Well, looks like you're out of time. Jake's heart pounded. He wasn't ready to be arrested. Not yet. And then, just like in the courtroom, he ran. Meanwhile, Judge Olivia Carter stood in front of a wall of monitors in the police precinct, watching the live footage from the stakeout. She saw the garage, the patrol cars, and then she saw him, Jake Simmons, bolting out the back door. Do not let him escape, she said into the radio. Copy that, came the officer's response. Olivia leaned forward, watching as the officers closed in. Jake was fast, but not faster than the law. This time, he wasn't getting away. Jake sprinted into the night, his breath sharp in his chest. The alley was dark, wet from the afternoon rain. His boots splashed through puddles. He could hear them behind him. Footsteps. Shouting. They were closing in. Up ahead, a chain-link fence. Too high to climb. Too late to turn back. His mind raced. He needed an escape. Then, suddenly, a pair of headlights flashed. A black SUV screeched to a stop right in front of him. The passenger door flew open. Get in, a voice shouted. Jake didn't think. He jumped inside. The door slammed shut. And just like that, he was gone. The SUV tore down the darkened streets, its tires screeching as it swerved onto the highway. Jake Simmons sat in the passenger seat, breathing hard, his heart pounding like a drum in his chest. He turned to see who had just saved him. The driver was a woman. Dark hair, piercing green eyes, and a sharp jawline. She wore a leather jacket, her hands gripping the wheel like she had done this 100 times before. Jake had never seen her before in his life. Who the hell are you? He demanded, still catching his breath. She didn't look at him. I just saved your ass. Jake narrowed his eyes. I didn't ask for a rescue. She smirked. Didn't look like you had a choice. The police sirens faded behind them, lost in the city streets. The SUV weaved through traffic effortlessly, moving like a ghost in the night. Jake's mind was still reeling. First, the judge had ordered his arrest. Then Frank had offered him a deal. Now, some mystery woman had just pulled him from the jaws of the law. Nothing about this night made sense. He clenched his fists. Where are we going? She finally looked at him. Somewhere safe. I don't even know you. She gave him a sideways glance. You don't need to. Jake didn't like this. He had spent his entire career being in control. Now, he felt like a rat in a maze, running blindly. He needed answers. Pull over, he ordered. The woman raised an eyebrow. Not happening. Jake's temper flared. I said. Before he could finish, she slammed the brakes. The SUV skidded to a stop on the side of the road. Jake barely had time to react before she pulled a gun and pointed it right at his chest. Now, you listen, she said coolly. I just risked my neck getting you out of there. If you don't want my help, say so. But don't bark orders at me. Jake swallowed hard, his hands raised slightly. He wasn't used to being on this side of the gun. His eyes darted to the weapon. Glock 19. Professional grip. Steady aim. This woman wasn't just some random driver. She knew what she was doing. Slowly, he nodded. All right, I'll listen. She held his gaze for a moment, then lowered the gun and started driving again. Jake let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. He studied her as she drove. Who sent you? He asked. She smirked. Not everything is about you, officer. That word, officer, the way she said it, it dripped with sarcasm. Jake scowled. You don't like cops, do you? She shrugged. I don't like dirty ones. Jake bristled. I'm not dirty. She gave him a sideways glance. Sure. Silence filled the car. Jake's thoughts swirled. He still didn't know who she was, or why she had helped him. But one thing was clear. This night was far from over. Meanwhile, Judge Olivia Carter stood in the police command center, staring at the screen in disbelief. Jake Simmons had escaped. Again. She exhaled sharply, pressing her hands against the table. How the hell did he get away? She asked. Detective Ryan Bennett, a seasoned officer with a grizzled beard and tired eyes, shook his head. We had him. Then that black SUV came out of nowhere. Olivia's eyes narrowed. Who was driving it? We don't know, Bennett admitted. No plates. No traffic cams caught it. It was like a ghost. Olivia gritted her teeth. Someone had helped Jake. Someone powerful. Someone who had planned this. She turned to Bennett. Issue an APB on that vehicle. I want roadblocks. I want every officer looking for him. Bennett nodded and picked up his radio. Olivia took a deep breath. Jake Simmons was on the run, and she wasn't about to let him slip away. Back in the SUV, Jake watched as the city lights blurred past. His body was tense, his mind racing. The woman still hadn't told him her name. So, he said finally, are you ever going to tell me why you helped me? She tapped her fingers on the steering wheel. You have information I need. Jake frowned. What kind of information? She shot him a look. The kind that can take down some very powerful people. Jake tensed. She knew. She knew about the files he had hidden. The ones he had collected over the years. Evidence of corruption inside the department. Evidence that could ruin careers. He had always kept them as insurance. Now, it seemed, someone else wanted them. Jake exhaled. Who are you working for? She smirked. The good guys. Jake chuckled darkly. Lady, I hate to break it to you, but there are no good guys. She didn't argue. Instead, she pulled off the highway and onto a secluded road. The SUV rolled to a stop in front of an abandoned warehouse. Jake's gut told him to be on guard. She turned off the engine and looked at him. You have two choices, she said. Walk away and get caught, or come inside and find out the truth. Jake hesitated. Then he sighed. He had already run this far. Might as well see how deep the rabbit hole went. He opened the door and stepped out. The woman led the way, pushing open the warehouse door. Jake followed, his senses on high alert. Inside, the air smelled of dust and old metal. Dim lights flickered overhead. And then, he stopped dead in his tracks. Standing in front of him was a man he hadn't seen in years. A man he thought was dead. His breath caught in his throat. No way. The man smirked. Surprised to see me, Simmons? Jake's mind reeled. This changed everything. And for the first time that night, he realized he was in way over his head. Jake Simmons stood frozen, his breath caught in his throat. The man in front of him, he wasn't supposed to be alive. Ethan Cross, a former detective. A man who had vanished 5 years ago under mysterious circumstances. Everyone assumed he was dead. Some whispered that he had been taken out by the very people he was investigating. But here he was, alive, and smirking like he had just seen an old friend. Jake's instinct screamed at him. He didn't trust Ethan, not for a second. What the hell is this? Jake growled, glancing at the woman beside him. Who are you people? The woman crossed her arms. Like I said before, we're the good guys. Ethan chuckled. That might be a stretch. He took a step forward, his eyes sharp. It's been a long time, Simmons. Jake's fists clenched. Not long enough. Ethan ignored the hostility. You look tense. Let me guess. You weren't expecting company? Jake exhaled sharply. I wasn't expecting a ghost. Ethan smirked. Fair enough. He leaned against an old metal desk, arms crossed. I'm guessing you have a lot of questions. Jake scoffed. Yeah. Like how the hell you're still breathing. Ethan's smirk faded slightly. That's a long story. Jake wasn't in the mood for games. Then make it short. Ethan exchanged a glance with the woman before speaking. I was investigating corruption in the department, Ethan said. Just like you. Jake stiffened. Ethan continued. I had too much evidence. Too many names. And they knew it. Jake felt a cold chill creep down his spine. They came for me, Ethan said. I barely got out alive. I had two choices, disappear or die. He gestured around the warehouse. So, I disappeared. Jake narrowed his eyes. And now you're back? Ethan's expression darkened. Because it's time to finish what I started. Jake let out a bitter laugh. And what does that have to do with me? Ethan's gaze locked onto his. Because you're the only one who has what we need. Jake felt the weight of those words settle over him. The files. The dirt he had collected over the years. The insurance policy that had suddenly turned into a death sentence. Jake exhaled. You expect me to just hand it over? Ethan tilted his head. If you don't, you're dead. Jake clenched his jaw. He knew Ethan was right. He had two choices, help them, or run until there was nowhere left to go. Before he could respond, the woman's phone buzzed. She pulled it out, her face darkening as she read the screen. We have a problem, she said. Jake tensed. What now? She turned the phone around. On the screen was a live news broadcast. Breaking news. Fugitive cop Jake Simmons sighted. Police close in. Jake's stomach dropped. The broadcast showed a map. A red dot blinked on the screen. It was their location. Ethan cursed under his breath. They found us. The woman spun around. We need to move. Now. Jake's pulse pounded. How the hell did they track us? Ethan's expression hardened. They must have bugged your car. Jake felt rage boil in his chest. He had been careful, but it didn't matter now. The sound of sirens filled the air. Growing louder. Closer. Ethan grabbed a duffel bag from the table and threw it over his shoulder. We're not getting caught here. Jake's mind was racing. His whole life, he had been the one doing the chasing. Now, he was the hunted. The woman pointed toward the back exit. We go through the tunnels. Jake hesitated for only a second before following them. The warehouse shook as the first police vehicles skidded to a stop outside. Voices shouted. Flashlights swept across the building. And then, the doors burst open. Gunshots rang out. Jake ducked as bullets tore through the walls. The chase was on. And this time, there was no turning back. Gunfire ripped through the warehouse, shattering windows and sending sparks flying from metal beams. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and dust as Jake, Ethan, and the woman sprinted toward the back exit. Move, Ethan barked, shoving open a metal door that led to the underground tunnels. Jake didn't need to be told twice. He dove through the doorway just as bullets slammed into the frame behind him. The woman followed, kicking the door shut. The tunnel was damp and dark, with flickering lights casting eerie shadows on the walls. This way, the woman said, leading them deeper inside. Jake's breath was ragged. His mind was racing. The police had found them too fast. Someone had tipped them off. Someone on the inside. But right now, there was no time to figure out who. They ran. Behind them, the door shook as officers tried to break through. Then boom. An explosion rocked the tunnel as the door was blasted open. The force sent Jake stumbling, but he caught himself just in time. The police weren't playing around anymore. They wanted him caught. Or worse, dead. Keep going, Ethan shouted. Jake pushed forward, his lungs burning. The tunnel stretched ahead, twisting and turning like a maze. The woman seemed to know where she was going, barely hesitating at each intersection. How do you know this place? Jake asked between breaths. I used to work here, she replied. Jake wanted to ask more, but there was no time. Behind them, the sound of boots pounding against the concrete echoed louder. They were gaining on them. Then, up ahead, a ladder. Ethan pointed. That's our way out. Jake reached it first and climbed as fast as he could, his muscles screaming in protest. He pushed open the hatch at the top and pulled himself onto the surface. They were in an abandoned parking lot. The woman climbed up next, followed by Ethan. Jake turned to run and froze. A spotlight blinded him. Police vehicles surrounded them. Dozens of officers had their guns raised, their faces tense. Jake's stomach dropped. It was over. Then, a voice cut through the chaos. Jacob Simmons, put your hands in the air. Jake's heart clenched. He knew that voice. Judge Olivia Carter. She stepped forward, her dark robe replaced by a fitted black suit. Her eyes locked onto his. You have nowhere left to run, she said firmly. Jake's jaw tightened. His mind screamed at him to bolt, to fight, to do something. But deep down, he knew. She was right. This was the end of the line. Or so he thought. Because just then, Ethan did something crazy. He grabbed Olivia Carter and put a gun to her head. The entire police force erupted in panic. Jake's breath caught. The woman beside him muttered a curse. "Ethan, what the hell are you doing? Getting us out of here," Ethan growled. Olivia's face remained calm, even with the barrel pressed against her temple. "Let me go," she said in a deadly voice. Ethan ignored her. "Everyone back off or she dies." The officers hesitated. Their hands tightened on their weapons. Jake's stomach twisted. This wasn't part of the plan. But Ethan didn't care. And the worst part? Jake had a sickening feeling that Ethan wasn't bluffing. The tension in the air was suffocating. Every officer in the lot had their weapons raised, their fingers hovering over the triggers. The red and blue lights of the police cruisers flashed in the darkness, painting everything in an eerie, pulsating glow. Ethan's grip on the gun was steady. His expression was cold, unshaken. He had Judge Olivia Carter locked against him, the barrel of his weapon pressed against her temple. "Put the gun down, Ethan," Jake said, his voice low but firm. Ethan didn't even flinch. "Not happening, Simmons." Jake's pulse pounded in his ears. This was bad. Really bad. Judge Carter didn't move. Didn't show even a flicker of fear. "Let me go, Ethan," she said, her voice controlled. "You know this won't end well for you." Ethan smirked. "Maybe. But at least I'll walk out of here." Jake took a step closer. "That's not how this works." Ethan's eyes flicked to him. "You think I won't do it?" Jake didn't answer. Because the truth was, he didn't know. Ethan was desperate. And desperate men did desperate things. The police commander, a burly man with graying hair, stepped forward, his voice booming. "Cross, you let her go now, and we'll talk about a deal." Ethan let out a bitter laugh. "A deal? Please. We both know how this ends." His grip on the judge tightened. Jake felt his body tense. He had spent his entire life thinking he was untouchable, thinking that if he was fast enough, strong enough, ruthless enough, he could control everything. But right now, everything was spinning out of his control. The woman, his mysterious rescuer, moved slightly beside him, her body shifting. Jake saw her reach for something. A knife. Before he could react, she moved. Fast. In a single motion, she lunged, stabbing Ethan in the arm. Ethan roared in pain, his grip on the judge loosening just for a second. And that second was all Olivia Carter needed. The judge twisted, slamming her elbow into Ethan's gut and spinning away from him. A gunshot rang out, but it missed. Ethan stumbled backward, clutching his arm where the knife was still buried. And before he could recover, Jake tackled him. The force of the impact sent both of them crashing to the ground. Ethan struggled, his injured arm weak. But Jake had the advantage now. He wrenched the gun from Ethan's grip and shoved him onto his back, pressing his forearm against his throat. "It's over," Jake growled. Ethan let out a dry chuckle, blood staining his sleeve. "For me? Or for you?" Jake's grip tightened. "Shut up." Around them, officers swarmed in. Ethan was yanked to his feet and cuffed. Jake sat there, breathing hard, his hands shaking. Then, slowly, he felt a dozen guns turn toward him. It took him a second to realize what was happening. Judge Carter was standing now, rubbing the side of her head where Ethan had held her. She turned to Jake, her expression unreadable. Then she spoke the words he had been dreading. "Jacob Simmons," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "You are under arrest." Jake felt his stomach drop. His mouth went dry. He looked around at the officers surrounding him, their guns still raised, waiting for his next move. He had spent his whole life as the one giving orders, the one walking away untouched. But now, there was nowhere left to run. He could try. He could fight. But deep down, he knew this was the end of the road. He exhaled slowly, and then he raised his hands, surrendering for the first time in his life. The cold steel of the handcuffs clicked around Jake Simmons' wrists, tighter than necessary. He winced but didn't resist. He could feel the weight of every eye on him. Officers, reporters, Judge Olivia Carter. The once feared cop, the man who had walked around like he owned the world, was now standing in the middle of a police parking lot in cuffs. A prisoner. An officer, One he vaguely recognized from his own precinct, grabbed his arm and began to lead him toward a squad car. Jake swallowed hard, his pride warring with the reality of the situation. This was real. He was going to jail. The reporters were already swarming beyond the police barricade, cameras flashing like lightning in the night. Disgraced officer arrested. Judge Olivia Carter takes down corrupt cop. He could already hear the headlines. But what bothered him most? It wasn't the cameras. It wasn't even the cuffs. It was Ethan Cross. As the officers shoved Jake into the back of the squad car, his gaze locked onto Ethan, who was being restrained by two cops near a separate vehicle. Ethan was bloody, beaten, but he still smirked, like he knew something Jake didn't, like he wasn't worried at all. That smirk sent a chill down Jake's spine, because if there was one thing he knew about men like Ethan Cross, they never smiled unless they had a backup plan. 1 hour later, the cell was small, gray walls, a single metal bench bolted to the floor. Jake sat there, his mind racing. How had everything gone so wrong so fast? Just days ago, he had been a cop with connections, a man who thought he was untouchable. Now, he was on the other side of the bars. It was ironic, cruel, even. And the worst part? He didn't even know what came next. The door to the holding area buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. Footsteps approached. He glanced up and felt his stomach tighten. Judge Olivia Carter. She stood just outside the bars, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. Jake exhaled slowly. Come to gloat? She didn't react. I came for answers. Jake let out a dry chuckle. That makes two of us. She stepped closer, gripping the bars lightly. Why did you run? Jake leaned back against the wall. You already made up your mind about me, Judge. What does it matter? Her gaze didn't waver. You had an entire courtroom watching. You could have fought the charges legally. Instead, you ran. That tells me you were afraid. Jake clenched his jaw. She wasn't wrong, but he wasn't about to admit that. Instead, he shrugged. I don't like being cornered. Olivia studied him. And Ethan Cross? Why did he help you? That made Jake pause. Because, truthfully, he didn't know. Ethan had disappeared years ago, only to show up at the exact moment Jake was on the run. And now they were both in jail. None of it added up. I have a better question, Jake said, sitting forward. Who tipped off the cops? They found us way too fast. Olivia's expression remained unreadable. You think someone set you up? I know someone did. Jake leaned in. And I don't think Ethan was the one they were after. For the first time, he saw a flicker of doubt in Olivia's eyes. Then she turned and walked away. Jake watched her go, his mind still racing. Someone had set him up. And until he figured out who, he was a dead man walking. Elsewhere, a dark room, a single desk, a phone ringing. A hand picked up the receiver. A smooth voice answered. It's done. A second voice replied. He's in custody. Just like you wanted. Silence. Then a quiet chuckle. Good. Now let's see if he survives the night. Click. The call ended. And in the darkness, someone smiled. Jake Simmons lay on the cold metal bench in his holding cell, staring at the ceiling. His mind wouldn't stop racing. Something was wrong. The police had found him too fast. Ethan Cross had reappeared out of nowhere. And now, sitting in this cell, he couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in. Whoever had set him up, whoever wanted him out of the way, was still out there. And he had a gut feeling they weren't done yet. A sharp buzz snapped him out of his thoughts. The door to the holding area opened. Footsteps. Slow. Purposeful. Jake sat up. A man walked in. Tall. Clean-shaven. A sharp suit that screamed power. Jake knew exactly who he was. Commissioner Daniel Graves. The most powerful cop in the city. Jake had worked under Graves for years. The man was a legend. Untouchable. Respected by the public, feared by the criminals, and by every officer who knew what he was really capable of. Graves stepped up to the bars, his hands casually in his pockets. He studied Jake for a long moment, then sighed. You really messed up, Simmons. Jake smirked, leaning back against the wall. Yeah? And here I thought I was the victim. Graves shook his head. You were warned. Told to keep your nose clean. But you didn't listen. Jake clenched his jaw. If you're here to tell me I should have stayed in line, save your breath. Graves chuckled, still cocky. Even now, he took a step closer, lowering his voice. You think Judge Carter is your biggest problem, he murmured. You have no idea how deep this goes. Jake's blood ran cold. He had suspected corruption in the department for years. He had collected evidence, names, money trails, backroom deals. But now, hearing Graves say it so casually, it confirmed his worst fears. Jake sat forward. You're the one who set me up. Graves smirked. I don't have to set you up, Simmons. You did that all on your own. Jake exhaled sharply. So what now? You're here to tie up loose ends? Graves shook his head. No, I'm here to offer you a choice. Jake narrowed his eyes. What kind of choice? Graves glanced at the security camera in the corner of the room, then back at Jake. I can make this go away, he said smoothly. The charges, the trial, all of it. Jake's stomach twisted. There was always a catch. Graves leaned in slightly. But in return, he continued, you disappear. Jake scoffed. Disappear? Graves nodded. Leave the city. Change your name. Forget everything you know. Jake's jaw tightened. And if I say no? Graves smiled. Then you won't make it to trial. Jake felt a chill crawl up his spine. This wasn't a warning. It was a promise. Graves patted the bars like a man satisfied with his work. You have until morning to decide. Then he turned and walked out. Jake sat there, heart pounding. He had two choices. Run or die. And either way, someone else was pulling the strings. Meanwhile, Judge Olivia Carter sat in her office, flipping through Jake's case file. Something wasn't right. The police had come down on Jake too fast. The way he was tracked, too clean. Almost like someone had wanted him caught. Her gut told her there was more to this. And her gut had never been wrong. A knock at her door. She looked up. Come in. Detective Ryan Bennett stepped inside, his face grim. We have a problem, he said. Olivia set down the file. What kind of problem? Bennett handed her a piece of paper. It was a transcript of a phone call, a recording made inside the precinct. She read the lines. Her heart stopped. The call was between Commissioner Graves and an unknown person. Graves. Simmons is in custody. Unknown. Good. Make sure he doesn't leave alive. Olivia's hands tightened around the paper. This wasn't just about Jake anymore. This was bigger. Much bigger. And now, she was in the middle of it. Back in the holding cell, Jake sat in silence, replaying Graves' words in his head. Then, a noise. A soft click. Jake tensed. He knew that sound. Someone had just unlocked his cell door. Slowly, it creaked open. Jake stood. He glanced into the hallway. Empty. No guards. No cameras turning. Someone had cut the feed. He felt his pulse quicken. This wasn't a mistake. It was a setup. He took one cautious step forward, and then he heard it. Footsteps. Slow. Steady. Someone was coming. Jake swallowed hard. And he knew, whoever it was coming to kill him. The footsteps echoed down the corridor, slow and deliberate. Jake Simmons' pulse pounded in his ears. He had spent years kicking down doors, hunting fugitives, chasing criminals in dark alleyways. Now, he was the one being hunted. The open cell door felt like a trap. He had two choices. Stay inside and wait for death, or walk out and fight. His muscles tensed. He wasn't going to die in a cell. He moved. Stepping into the hallway, he pressed his back against the cold concrete wall. The dim fluorescent lights flickered overhead. The footsteps were getting closer. Then, a shadow. Someone turned the corner. Jake's body coiled, ready to strike. But just as he lunged, a hand shot up. Wait, a voice hissed. Jake froze, his fist inches from the man's jaw. It wasn't a guard. It was Detective Ryan Bennett. Jake's breath caught. Bennett. Bennett's face was tense. We need to move. Now. Jake didn't move. What the hell is going on? Bennett exhaled sharply. Commissioner Graves put a hit on you. You were never supposed to make it to trial. Jake's stomach twisted. He had suspected it, but hearing it out loud, it made it real. Bennett reached into his pocket, pulling out a key card. I cut the feed, but it won't take them long to figure it out. If we don't leave now, you're dead. Jake's mind raced. Was this a setup? Was Bennett really helping him, or just leading him into another trap? He had no time to decide. A door slammed somewhere down the hall. Shouting voices. They had been spotted. Move. Bennett barked. Jake didn't hesitate. They ran. Meanwhile, Judge Olivia Carter was speeding down the highway, her hands gripping the steering wheel. She had just read the transcript. She knew what Graves was planning. And now, she knew. Jake Simmons wasn't the villain in this story. He was a loose end, and they were about to tie it up permanently. She grabbed her phone and dialed Bennett. No answer. She clenched her jaw. Something was already happening. She floored the gas pedal. She had one chance to stop this before it was too late. Back at the precinct, Bennett swiped the keycard at the security door. The red light blinked. Access denied. Damn it, Bennett hissed. He swiped again. Still locked. Jake gritted his teeth. Hurry up, Bennett. Boots pounded against the floor behind them. A voice shouted, They're in the lower wing. Block the exits. Jake spun around. For men were coming. Not officers. Black tactical gear. Silencers on their weapons. Hitmen. Jake's stomach turned to ice. Open the door, he barked. Bennett cursed under his breath, swiping the card one last time. Green light. The door unlocked. They burst through into the garage level. Rows of police cars sat in the dim light. Jake's eyes darted around. They needed a way out. Bennett pointed. There. A police SUV. Keys in the ignition. Jake didn't question their luck. They sprinted for it. Gunfire erupted. Bullets shattered the windows of the parked cars. Jake slid across the hood of the SUV, yanking open the driver's side door. Bennett jumped in the passenger seat. Jake turned the key. The engine roared to life. Tires screeched as Jake floored the gas pedal, whipping the vehicle toward the exit ramp. The garage door was closing. Jake's jaw clenched. Not today. He slammed the accelerator. The SUV barreled forward. At the last second, they crashed through the half-closed garage door. Metal ripped. Glass shattered. They burst onto the street, nearly clipping a parked car. Jake's hands gripped the wheel as he spun into traffic. Bennett's breathing was heavy. We're not safe yet. Jake's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. Two black SUVs tore out of the precinct behind them. High-speed pursuit. Jake exhaled sharply. Of course not. He yanked the wheel hard. And the chase was on. Elsewhere, Commissioner Daniel Graves stood in his office, watching the chaos unfold on a security feed. Jake Simmons had escaped. His jaw tightened. He picked up his phone, dialing a number. A smooth voice answered. Yes? Graves' expression darkened. Kill him. Now. Jake Simmons gritted his teeth, white-knuckling the steering wheel as he weaved through traffic at 80 miles per hour. Behind him, two black SUVs surged forward, their headlights burning like twin demons in the night. Bennett, in the passenger seat, reloaded his gun with shaky hands. We need to lose them. Jake smirked grimly. No kidding. He yanked the wheel, cutting across 2 lanes of traffic. Horns blared. Cars swerved to avoid collision. The SUVs didn't hesitate. They followed. Fast, ruthless, determined. Jake glanced at the mirror. He knew who had sent them. Graves. This wasn't just a high-speed chase. This was an execution. Bennett looked behind them, his voice tense. They're closing in. Jake pushed the gas pedal to the floor. The police SUV roared forward, racing down the highway. Up ahead, the road split. Left, the city. Right, the bridge. Jake made his choice in a split second. He yanked the wheel, hard right. The SUV veered off, tires screeching as it shot onto the bridge. The black SUVs followed. Jake clenched his jaw. The bridge was under construction. Half of it was blocked with barricades. Equipment littered the lanes. This was a dead end. Bennett saw it too. His face paled. Tell me you have a plan. Jake's pulse thundered. There was no plan. Just instincts. And his instincts told him he had one shot. Meanwhile, Judge Olivia Carter sped down the highway, her sirens blaring. She had just one goal: get to Jake before Graves' men did. But as she turned onto the bridge, her stomach dropped. She saw the black SUVs, the high-speed pursuit, and then she saw the dead end. Her hands tightened on the wheel. Don't do anything stupid, Simmons, she whispered. Back on the bridge, Jake's SUV barreled toward the blockade. Behind him, the black SUVs gained ground. 50 yards. 40 yards. Bennett tensed. Jake. 30 yards. 20 yards. Jake jerked the wheel. The SUV slammed sideways into a construction barrier, sending sparks flying. Then, he threw it into reverse. The SUV spun 180 degrees, now facing the oncoming SUVs. Bennett's eyes widened. Are you insane? Jake smirked. Hold on. The black SUVs weren't stopping. Jake hit the gas. Full speed. Bennett braced himself. The SUVs in front of them opened fire. Jake yanked the wheel, sending the SUV into a tailspin. Bullets ripped through the windshield, but missed. The first black SUV tried to swerve. Too late. Jake rammed into its side at full speed. Metal crunched. The black SUV spun wildly out of control, crashing through the barricade. And then, it plunged off the bridge. Jake barely had time to process it, because the second SUV was still coming. At the same time, Olivia saw it all happen. The crash. The SUV going over the edge. Her heart pounded. Then she saw the second SUV. Jake wasn't out of danger yet. She grabbed her radio. All units, move in. Now. On the bridge, Jake saw the second SUV coming. Fast. Too fast. He had seconds to react. His hands gripped the wheel. But before he could move, the black SUV slammed into them. The impact was brutal. Jake's head snapped forward. Metal crushed. Glass shattered. The police SUV spun out of control, hitting the concrete divider. Jake's vision blurred. The world tilted. Then, the SUV flipped. Everything went dark. Seconds later, pain. That was the first thing Jake felt. His whole body ached. The SUV was on its side, steam hissing from the engine. Bennett groaned beside him, dazed. Jake blinked, trying to focus. Then he heard it. Footsteps, crunching over broken glass. A figure approached. Jake squinted through the shattered windshield. Commissioner Daniel Graves. Standing there, watching him, a gun in his hand. Jake's blood ran cold. Graves smiled. End of the road, Simmons. He raised the gun. Jake tried to move, too slow. Then, bang. A single gunshot rang out. Jake flinched, but the bullet didn't hit him, because Graves suddenly staggered backward. A red stain spread across his chest. Jake's blurry vision cleared, and then he saw her, Judge Olivia Carter, standing behind Graves, gun smoking in her hand. Graves' eyes widened in shock. Then, he collapsed, dead. Jake stared at Olivia, stunned. She exhaled, lowering her weapon. Looks like you owe me one. Jake Simmons sat on the cold pavement, his back against the wrecked SUV. His entire body ached, his head spinning from the impact. Commissioner Daniel Graves lay motionless a few feet away, his blood pooling on the cracked asphalt. Judge Olivia Carter stood over him, her gun still smoking. The silence that followed was deafening. Red and blue lights flashed as police units stormed onto the bridge, sirens blaring. Officers swarmed the area, weapons drawn, scanning for threats. Bennett groaned, pushing himself up from the wreckage, looking at Jake with wide eyes. Are we still alive? Jake let out a ragged chuckle. Barely. Then, officers surrounded them. Guns trained on Jake, on Bennett, even on Olivia. Drop your weapons, an officer yelled. Olivia slowly lowered her gun, her hands open. Stand down, she commanded. The officers hesitated, then finally recognized her. The tension in the air cracked like thunder. A lieutenant stepped forward, his face pale. Judge Carter, what happened here? Olivia glanced at Graves' body. Justice. The officer swallowed hard. And Simmons? All eyes turned to Jake. Jake exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the past few days crushing down on him. He had spent his entire life believing he was untouchable, that the rules didn't apply to him, that he was above the law. And yet, in the end, it was the law that saved him. He looked at Olivia, and for the first time in a long time, Jake Simmons told the truth. I was part of the problem, he admitted. His voice was low but steady. But Graves? He was worse. He ran this city from the shadows. controlled everything, covered up corruption, eliminated anyone who got too close. He looked back at the wreckage, where Graves' body still lay, and he almost got away with it. The lieutenant exchanged a glance with his men. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Take them in," he ordered. Jake didn't resist as the officers cuffed him. For the second time in his life, he was under arrest. But this time, it felt different. 1 month later, the courtroom was packed. Cameras flashed. Reporters whispered into microphones. The entire nation was watching. Judge Olivia Carter sat behind the bench, her gaze sweeping over the crowded room. But today, she wasn't the one on trial. This time, it was the department itself. The corruption scandal that had once been buried deep within the police force was now exposed to the world. Evidence had been released. Testimonies had been given. Names had been named. And in the middle of it all, Jake Simmons. He sat at the defendant's table, wearing a suit instead of a uniform. A former cop. A fugitive. And now, a witness. He had struck a deal. In exchange for full cooperation, his charges had been reduced. He wouldn't walk away free. But he wouldn't rot in prison either. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was justice. As Olivia called the court to order, Jake sat back and exhaled. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was running anymore. Epilogue. 6 months later, Jake Simmons stepped out of the courthouse, the cold morning air biting at his skin. He was free. Not in the way he once imagined. No badge, no power, no influence. But free. He turned, and there she was. Judge Olivia Carter. Watching him, he smirked. "Came to see me off?" She crossed her arms. "Wanted to make sure you actually left." Jake chuckled. "What now?" Olivia studied him. "That's up to you." For the first time, Jake didn't have an answer. For so long, he had only known one way to live. But now he had a second chance. He nodded at Olivia. "Thanks. For everything." She gave him a small smile. "Don't make me regret it." And with that, she turned and walked away. Jake took one last look at the courthouse, then exhaled. Then he turned the other way and walked toward whatever came next.